It started with a laugh. Sharp, high-pitched, the kind that stings more than it should. A group of teenagers had gathered around the old tank parked near the corn dog stand at the edge of the county fair. Painted olive drab with a white star still faintly visible beneath the flaking layers, the machine looked like something dragged from another life, another world. One boy climbed onto the treads while his friend posed beside the turret, flashing a grin and flexing muscles that had never known the weight of armor. A girl snapped a photo, then muttered loud enough to be heard. Who even used this junk? Probably never saw action. The others laughed again. Another voice piped up. Bet it just sat in a field somewhere while real soldiers did the work. No one noticed the man standing off to the side. He was still, like a statue that didn't belong at a fair. Late 70s, maybe older. Dressed in a plain beige windbreaker, a ball cap pulled low over silver hair, and khaki slacks creased at the seams. But it was the patch on his jacket sleeve that mattered most. Barely visible, but unmistakable to anyone who'd worn the same. An armored division insignia, faded from decades of sun. He watched without speaking. His eyes weren't angry, just quiet, steady, holding something none of the teenagers could imagine. After a moment, he stepped forward. No one noticed at first. He didn't shout, he didn't scold. He simply laid his hand on the tank. A slow, deliberate gesture, palm resting flat on cool steel, like greeting an old friend or saying goodbye. That was when the noise began to falter. One of the teens, the girl with the camera, tilted her head. She lowered her phone. The boy on the treads hopped down, unsure why. Because the man wasn't putting on a show. He wasn't here for them. He closed his eyes, for a moment just breathed. And the fair, with its cotton candy haze, its swirling rides, its loudspeakers and laughter, grew dimmer. If that moment meant something to you, type respect in the comments. Subscribe to Soul Story so you won't miss the stories that truly stay with you. Then, almost like he was remembering the weight of it, the man walked slowly around the tank. He traced the hull with his fingertips, brushed a mark near the turret with the back of his hand, and when he reached the left side, he paused. There, beneath a streak of worn paint, was a set of letters, barely legible. June's Promise. A name. No one had seen it until he stopped there. He didn't cry, but his lip trembled. His shoulders shifted just a bit, the kind of movement a man makes when a memory washes over and leaves him changed. And still, not a single word spoken. By now, a small group had gathered. The teens, a fair vendor holding a tray of lemonade, a mother and her child hand in hand. People slowed not because they were told to, but because the stillness asked something of them. It took 5 full minutes before the first whisper came. I think he served in that. And in that whisper, something began. A shift, a ripple. Not because of a speech, not because of medals, but because of a hand on steel. A man who had returned, a tank that had survived, and the silence it brought. His name was Walter Griggs. It wasn't printed anywhere, not on a plaque or pamphlet, not announced over the loudspeakers piping carnival music through the fairgrounds. But after a while, someone asked, and he answered, softly, almost reluctantly, as though he hadn't said his full name out loud in years. I'm Walt. Used to go by Sergeant, long time ago. He didn't speak for attention. He spoke because someone stood beside him. A fair volunteer, maybe in her 40s, hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady and kind. And she'd simply asked, "Sir, do you know this tank?" Walt let out a breath that carried decades. "Yeah," he said, "she was mine." The phrase didn't mean much to the teenagers at first, but to anyone who had worn a uniform or loved someone who had, those 4 words weighed heavy. She was mine. There were no weapons left inside the tank. The engine hadn't run in decades. The steel was cold, the inside stripped and preserved for display. But to Walt, she still breathed with memory, still carried the echoes of voices long gone. He rested one hand on the turret ring. "We were just kids," he said. "Me, Benny, Travis, Doc, and McClellan. God, McClellan was a riot, always humming old country songs even when shells were dropping." People were listening now. A child tugged at his father's hand and pointed. "Is that a real tank, Dad?" The father nodded and hushed him, eyes fixed on Walt. She was called June's Promise because Benny named her after his wife. Said he'd come home to her in June, and that was the promise. Every mission, he'd touch the name before we rolled out. Walt's voice didn't crack, but his eyes grew glassy. Benny didn't come home. None of them did. Just me. He paused, then looked up. I asked if I could bring her home too. They said no. Years passed, and I figured she was scrap. But yesterday, someone sent me a photo. Said they found her, cleaned her up, sent her here. For kids to climb on. His tone wasn't angry, just hollow. But then he smiled, barely. I guess that's okay. She's strong. She can hold the weight. Someone handed him a folding chair. Someone else brought a bottle of water. He didn't ask, they just did it. And for the next hour, Walt sat beside the tank, answering questions with the patience of a man who'd waited decades to speak. Not in grand declarations, just moments, gestures, memories. He spoke about the desert heat and the chill of fear, the way the treads screamed over rock, how they once broke down in a ravine and sang to pass the time until help came. He never said he was a hero, never used the word bravery, but he did say this. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't going, it was coming back, knowing they didn't. A teen, one of the same who had laughed earlier, knelt by the front of the tank and read the name aloud. June's Promise. Then he looked at Walt and nodded. A real nod, the kind that says, I didn't know, but I do now. And just like that, the moment began to stretch beyond the fair. The county organizer appeared, apologized gently, sincerely, said they didn't know the tank's history when they brought it in as a static display. Promised to add a plaque, maybe even a short tribute. Walt just waved it off. You don't owe me anything, he said, but you owe them. Just tell their stories. That's enough. By late afternoon, someone had printed a sign. Tank formerly commanded by SGT Walter Griggs, named June's Promise in honor of a fallen comrade's wife. They placed it on a folding easel, not fancy, but honest. Walt didn't stay for the fireworks that night. He stood up, shook hands with those who offered, then took one last walk around the tank. When he stopped by the turret again, he did something quiet, private. He placed a small folded photograph on the track. It was weather-worn, the edges curled, but it showed 5 young men, sitting atop that same tank, arms around each other, smiling at something off-camera. June's Promise behind them, dust in the air, hope in their eyes. And with that, Walt turned and left. The fair moved on, as fairs do. The music resumed, kids lined up for funnel cake. Rides spun under string lights that flickered into the dusk. Laughter returned, carried by the scent of popcorn and fried pickles. But something had changed. Not loudly, not obviously. Like a whisper that lingers longer than it should. Because people kept looking at the tank. And not like before. Now they read the sign first. They walked slower around it. Some touched the steel with reverence. A few knelt by the treads, as if the ground held something sacred. The teens who had laughed earlier, they came back too. They didn't say much, but one of them, the boy who'd flexed for the camera, returned with a Sharpie and a sheet of cardstock. He didn't deface anything, just wrote out 5 names. SGT Walter Griggs, CPL Benjamin Benny Lang, SPC Travis Clay, PFC David Doc Ramirez, PVT Samuel McClellan. He taped it beneath the official sign and wrote in all caps, "Thank you." No one took it down. Not the staff, not the organizers, not the historians who came later. Because sometimes the rawest memorials aren't made of bronze. They're made of ink and paper and a boy who didn't know, but who now carries a piece of the story. That night, a small ripple became a wave. The local newspaper ran a short piece. Tank at County Fair turns out to be veterans' former command, forgotten history remembered. A columnist added a photo. Walt's hand on the tank, face turned away. The caption simply read, "Some heroes don't need parades." Walt didn't ask for the coverage. He didn't know, in fact, until a neighbor brought him the paper the next morning. He smiled when he saw it, then folded the page neatly and tucked it inside an old wooden box where he kept medals, a pocket Bible, and a letter that had traveled across the ocean in 1969. For Walt, the moment had passed, but for the town, it had just begun. A local teacher clipped the story and used it in her civics class. A librarian gathered children around and read a simplified version for story hour. One girl drew a crayon picture of the tank with a heart above it and gave it to the fair organizers to hang next year. Small things, but like all ripples, they touched more than expected. By the end of the week, the fair board voted unanimously to retire the tank as a photo prop. They placed it on a cement pad near the entrance, roped gently with chain and flowers at its base. They installed a bench beside it. A simple wooden seat. No inscription, no dedication, just space for quiet. Walt visited it again, not on ceremony, not for crowds, just on a Thursday, alone. He sat on the bench, watched the breeze move the small American flag someone had left in the barrel's mouth. And then he pulled something from his jacket. A small velvet pouch. Inside, a single silver star. Not the kind handed out at parades, but the kind earned in dust and smoke and blood. He didn't place it on the tank. Instead, he set it on the bench beside him. For a minute, maybe 2, then picked it up again. Because some things are meant to be remembered, but not left behind. He stood, gave a slow, deliberate salute, and walked away. News travels differently in small towns, not in breaking alerts or broadcast tickers, but through front porches, church steps, and late-night diner booths. By the end of the month, nearly everyone knew about June's promise. It wasn't just a tank anymore. It had become a story, and more than that, a touchstone. Children who once saw it as a jungle gym now stood beside it with their parents, asking quiet questions. Veterans who rarely left their homes found reasons to stop by, not to relive the past, but to feel less alone in it. One man left a small cross carved from oak. Another left a bracelet with a name etched into the metal. A widow brought her husband's old beret and tied it to the chain. It wasn't a monument built by a committee. It was a living memorial built by memory. And Walt, he came less often now. He didn't need to visit every week. The burden he'd carried for so long had lightened, shared across shoulders that didn't even know they were strong enough to hold it. But when he did return, it was different. He smiled more, spoke longer. Once, he brought a young boy with him, his great-nephew, maybe 6 or 7 years old, clutching a toy soldier and walking with the unsure bounce of childhood. They sat on the bench together. The boy asked questions, fast, scattered, and half understood. Walt answered each one with the patience of a man who knew the right time had finally come. When the boy asked, "Were you scared?" Walt didn't pretend. He said, "Every time. But I had a job, and they were counting on me. He didn't say courage, didn't need to. That evening, the boy drew a picture of the tank. This one had faces in the windows, smiles on the men, a sun in the sky. And at the bottom, written in crooked block letters, "My Uncle Walt was brave." No medals were awarded that day. No parade rolled through town. But the picture went up on the bulletin board outside the community center, taped between bait sale flyers and lost dog notices. Because that's where legacy belongs, among the living. The following year, the county fair opened again. And this time, the tank wasn't near the corn dogs. It had its own space, fenced gently with flags, framed by rose bushes. A permanent plaque now told the full story, not just of Walt, but of Benny, Travis, Doc, and McClellan. The teens returned too, older now, changed. One had joined the reserves. Another was studying to be a history teacher. The girl who snapped the original photo had started a photography project called Faces of Quiet Valor. She printed a large black and white portrait of Walt touching the tank and placed it beside the plaque. People stopped to stare. Some for minutes, some just for moments, but all of them felt it. That hush, that ripple, that moment when you realize heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just rests a hand on steel and remembers. Years passed. The fairgrounds changed. New rides, new booths, the old lemonade stand replaced with a sleeker trailer. Generations turned over, like soil in spring, quietly and without fanfare. But the tank remained. The bench weathered. The flag was replaced every few months by unseen hands. And the name, June's Promise, was no longer just paint. It was story, memory, a reminder. Walt came less and less. Not because he forgot, but because he had passed the story on. In quiet moments, over coffee with neighbors, in phone calls with a grandson who served now in a different kind of war, in a different kind of world. He never called himself a hero, not once. But when the school board voted to add his name to the district's annual essay contest on service and sacrifice, he came to the ceremony anyway, sat in the back, listened with misted eyes as a 12-year-old girl read a letter she had written to the man who kept a promise that wasn't even his. She had never met Benny, didn't know his wife June, had never even seen a real battlefield. But she ended her speech with words that made Walt look down and grip his cane a little tighter. You were never alone, because now we remember too. That evening, Walt stayed longer than usual. He walked with effort, slower than the year before. But when he reached the bench, he didn't sit. He stood beside the tank, touched the turret one last time, and whispered something only the wind heard. Then he smiled. Not with pride, not with sadness, with peace. A kind of peace that comes when the silence is broken, not by noise, but by understanding. When your story, once carried alone, becomes part of someone else's heartbeat. Walt passed away quietly that winter, in his home, in his sleep. The obituary was modest, just a few lines in the local paper. But the day of his funeral, the town showed up. Not just neighbors, veterans, students, fair volunteers, people who had only seen the photo but had felt something shift when they did. And at the cemetery, when the service ended and the wind picked up, something beautiful happened. A boy stepped forward, the same great nephew who once drew a crayon tank with smiles in the windows. He was older now, taller, eyes clearer. He placed a folded paper at the foot of the casket. It was the same drawing, slightly faded, but still there. My Uncle Walt was brave. And beside it, written with a steadier hand, so were his friends. That summer, the fairgrounds installed a second plaque beside June's Promise. It didn't list battles, or dates, or divisions. It said this: to those who serve without asking for thanks, to those who remember when others forget, To those who come home and still carry the weight of those who didn't, we see you. We remember, and we promise. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in silence. A deep, still, honest silence. And then, as if carried by some unspoken signal, they began to leave small things. A ribbon, a dog tag, a folded note. Each one a whisper in the wind. Each one part of a legacy no longer forgotten. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Story. Join us for more powerful and inspiring journeys. Thank you for watching.